so excited to have you here to celebrate The Other Olympians by Michael Waters. My name is Bex. I'm the events coordinator at Bookstar Magic, which, if you don't know, is an independent bookshop just a few blocks down on Smith Street. We're so excited to have you here tonight. Just want to point out a few housekeeping notes. The first is that there is a bathroom just around this corner. It is the white door that says toilets above it. At the end, we will be doing a hand-raised Q&A, so think of your questions, hold on them tight. We'll probably get them answered. Afterwards, Michael will be signing and personalizing at the table where you checked in. That's gonna be great. We'll tell you when to line up for that. If you're joining us virtually, you can buy a copy of The Other Olympians using the link in the live stream description. If you're here, you can buy a copy with us at the front. We also have Hugh's books. You can buy copies of those. Do not make me take them back to the store. Take them to your homes, give them to your friends and your family and your neighbors and your pets. And a little bit about why we're all here tonight. In The Other Olympians, Michael Waters uncovers for the first time the gripping true stories of pioneering trans and intersex athletes from the early mid-20th century. Immersive and revelatory, The Other Olympians is a groundbreaking, hidden in the archives marvel, an inspiring call for equality, and an essential contribution towards understanding the contemporary culture wars over gender in sports today. It's also a huge staff favorite. Everyone's staff is so excited about this book. And you can trust us, because I told you could. Michael Waters, star of tonight's show, has written for the New Yorker, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Wired, State. Hugh, our conversation extraordinaire, is also a writer and curator, most recently of the Women's House of Detention and When Brooklyn Was Queer, which we of course both have. Also huge staff favorites. You should get those as well. He'll also be signing. Such a treat. Without any further delay, please join me in giving one more warm welcome to Michael.
Okay, so I want to start this off with like a quick video of the, let's see if this works, of the main athlete in this book. Well, I'll keep to not working. Do you think I should? Okay, but I can just explain this video. It will show up. Okay, perfect. Also, thank you all for coming. It's very overwhelming to see this many people, but you know, it's an honor. But yeah, so I mean, this book is sort of, it kind of goes a lot of places, but at the heart of the story is this Czech athlete named Zdeněk Koubek, who was like a star in women's sports. And then in December 1935, he announced that he was transitioning gender and would begin living as a man. And then he becomes like this kind of global celebrity for a little bit, like tons of media covers him, and there's like lots of like really cool interviews and footage of him. At some point he's like from the Czech Republic, but at some point he comes to New York to perform on Broadway. And this clip is actually from him in New York in August. Speaking to the mic. Okay, sorry. Oh my gosh. Did anyone hear any of that? Okay, I can just redo it really. Okay. Sorry. Okay. Anyway, Zdeněk Koubek, that's his name. He's a Czech athlete, and he transitions gender in December 1935, and then he becomes a global celebrity. And then in August 1936, as the Berlin Olympics are happening, he comes to New York to perform on Broadway. And so, like, he was always, like, mobbed by a lot of press, and so this is, like, a clip from this, like, very weird newsreel in the Hearst archive that I don't know if it ever aired. I couldn't find proof of it airing. And they also, like, really choreograph him in kind of a interesting way, in terms of, like, the history. But let me just play this video. But just to, like, give you sort of a sense of, like, who he was, and yes.
Bezpečí, samozřejmě. To je
you go.
Well, he is going to work now in the French casino, you see. And then he'll start the game maybe like an athlete, you see. He's going to try and compete against men. Yes, that's it.
Okay, that's all it was. But yeah, so I just wanted to give like sort of a sense of like who he was, and yeah, like the sort of like what the press was interested in at the time. Like they were like incredibly fascinated by the fact that he was like dating women, and like was like did eventually marry a woman. And so I thought I'd just like give a brief introduction of the book, and I'm just gonna read like just a couple pages. Don't worry. Not gonna be a long reading. I also mess up all the time when I read, so it's mercifully short for everyone. So the book is centered on Kobek, and it's kind of about like how after he transitions, like the way that he's received by the public is with this like sense of like I think real curiosity about him. Like you see like plenty of sensationalism in the headlines, and like plenty of like words that I think like absolutely would not fly today, but like overall people are interested in what he means for kind of the possibilities of gender. And I should also say like, which maybe Hugh would get into, but like this was also an era before there was like a defined idea of gender as this kind of like psychological socialized identity. So when people were talking about this, they were talking about like biological sex, which also made for some like really wild reporting to try to explain like how someone could transition. Often the articles would talk about how he like quote unquote metamorphosized. And so he transitions in December 1935, and then what happens is he gets all this press, and then a few months later, this British athlete named Mark Weston, who I'm not gonna talk about as much just because of, we can't overload, but he, in May 1936, also announces that he's now living as a man. And he was a little bit less famous than Kobek, but also had participated in women's sports a little bit earlier and had since retired. And so the book is, the book is talking about them specifically, and then kind of about the public reaction, and then what happened was ultimately this reactionary fallout from a few sports officials, many of whom were associated with the Olympics and the International Olympic Committee, and eventually passed through these like really sort of crude and like really poorly thought through policies that eventually would come to be sex testing, which is still like actively enforced today at the Olympics, just on a kind of a different level, like enforced by sports federations, but essentially like today are used against like trans femme athletes in particular, and also intersex women. And this all traces back to 1936 into just like those specific politics. So that's what the book's about. I have a couple of the pages to read. Let's see how this will go. Okay, so I just kind of explained Kobek, but like if you just want a sense of like what the coverage was like, this is like kind of the middle of the book. This is sort of like after he announces he's transitioning, there's this flurry of coverage about him, and then, the news that Kobek was officially dressing as a man spread swiftly. Quote, "Czech athlete now a man," the New York Times declared on December 29th, as if a mere change of clothes was the deciding factor in validating his gender. For journalists, Kobek's new presentation introduced some novel linguistic difficulties. How should they refer to someone who, in their eyes, had just crossed the boundaries between man and woman? While most reporters switched off between male and female pronouns to describe Kobek, others simply dubbed him the changed person, seemingly torn on what to make of Kobek's current gender status. Another split the difference. Quote, "Ex-woman makes debut as man." Though they didn't always apply the most sensitive language to describe him, most newspapers remained largely unalarmed by Kobek's transition. To the public, it seemed, it was intriguing to consider that the boundaries of sex were so permeable. It didn't take long for the public fascination with Kobek to trickle down into his day-to-day life. Shortly after Christmas, Kobek took his new girlfriend out on a dinner date. The sight of Kobek kissing the young woman on the hand and locking arms with her as they walked across the street caused a, quote, "sensation" among onlookers, according to one newspaper. Just a few weeks earlier, when the world understood Kobek to be a woman, a public display of affection for a girlfriend would have been illegal. As a man, he could kiss her in public without fear. Columnists joked about what would happen if others followed Kobek's lead and transitioned. Quote, certainly if we must be prepared to find our men friends suddenly become women, and our women men, a new terror has been added to life, a British writer quipped. For, well, think of the things that men say exclusively to men. By January, Kobek had figured out how to parlay his newfound fame into a business. Kobek's doctors weren't charging him for his surgeries, citing their scientific interest in understanding sex reassignment procedures. But the other aspects of transitioning, like hiring a lawyer to correct a sex marker, weren't cheap. To pay the bills, he started charging for photographs and interviews. Paparazzi pictures of him were, quote, commanding high prices, and Kobek hired a, quote, ex-professional boxer to serve as his manager, according to one report. Whenever the press tried to take a picture of Kobek without permission, the boxer threw himself in the way. It turned out that journalists were more than happy to pay for the chance to interview him, a practice that was not uncommon among tabloids at the time. Kobek asked for $500 from the US wire service in exchange for an exclusive interview. An unnamed French newspaper paid 1,000 francs for a sit-down with him. In just a few weeks, Kobek had become an international media sensation. Then I have one more section to read. And then, okay, this is a bit later, so we're skipping around. Basically, I'm sure we're gonna get into this, but like, this was an era in the 1930s when there weren't sort of outwardly identified like gay or queer newspapers. And so you kind of had to be like creative in how you find these, like how you find queerness in the archive and how you find like how queer people responded to Kobek and to Weston, these two athletes who had transitioned. And I mean, to me that was like both kind of fascinating and also really important to this story, is to situate them in the community. Because like, as you guys saw in that clip, like often there was this sense of kind of sensationalism and of them being kind of like isolated and for public display in some of the news coverage. And so I did find some glimmers of queerness, as we will see. And so I just wanted to read that section, and it's about this one particular, like, absolutely wild tabloid, that's another story, but called Sexology. Yeah, I'll just briefly read. As a teenager in Newcastle, Wyoming in the 1930s, far away from the bustle of cosmopolitan Europe, the future gay activist Elver Barker often drove into town with his friend to buy the queerest thing around, a pulp publication called Sexology. Sexology was, ostensibly, a magazine of science. It took the reams of medical research on sex and sexuality and distilled them down so that regular people could understand. In an era in which mainstream newspapers referred to homosexuality only through euphemisms, Sexology was the one place many readers could encounter frank discussions about queer issues. For being a magazine of science, Sexology had a complicated relationship to evidence, at times letting sensationalism guide its editorial strategy. But its pop science ethos also helped it push boundaries. In the early 1930s, it published articles about whether homosexuals could conduct happy lives, or about women who lived together in pseudo-marriages. Queer people flocked to it. The United States didn't have a publication catering openly to the queer community, and hadn't since Chicago police shut down the short-lived gay newsletter Friendship and Freedom in 1924. Sexology was, in 1936, the closest analog to a gay magazine. Readers wrote into the Q&A section, offering a rare glimpse into the fabric of queer experience in 1930s America. One reader asked whether it was possible for a surgeon to construct an artificial vagina. The magazine responded that, yes, it was. Another wrote concerned that she was attracted to both sexes. Sexology counseled her not to worry, though it suggested that she focus on dating men. When Sexology first reported on Kobek and Weston in August 1936, it noted that their gender transitions had proven, quote, intriguing to the general public, but it wanted to correct some misinformation. Quote, here we are undoubtedly dealing with an intersexual case, Sexology wrote of Weston and Kobek. Quote, nature was uncertain as to her intentions while a baby was being formed, as to whether it should finally be man or woman. It would turn into a blockbuster story for the magazine. When Sexology published that first article on the two athletes, quote, a considerable number of readers were much stirred, as the magazine explained in a follow-up article. Quote, some of them wrote and inquired whether the same could not be done for them. End quote. This is actually harder to read than I thought. And if so, how could they go about it? What kind of surgical operation would they need, and who could they go to for more information? Letters poured in from across the United States, from trans and intersex people of all genders. The story of Kobek and Weston prompted one person, whom the world perceived as a man, to ask Sexology, and then this is like a big block quote. Could I live the balance of my life as a woman, as I have desired to be all my life? It seems to me that it would pay me for the years of suffering I've already put in. As I understand it, female sex hormones will cause the ability to give milk from the male breast. These are conditions which are foremost in my thoughts. I have always desired to be able to nurse a baby. That's the end of the quote. Another letter that Sexology excerpted came from a reader who, despite being perceived publicly as a woman, wrote that, quote, "There is nothing feminine about me." They asked, quote, "Would it not be advisable to undergo what operations are necessary to become the male I wish to be? Can you refer me to a competent surgeon who would be interested in my case?" End of quote. The outpouring of responses from readers baffled the editors of Sexology, who grasped at an explanation for why so many were interested in transitioning gender themselves. The editors referred to at least one reader, a textile worker from Alabama, whose story the historian Jules Gill Peterson has chronicled, directly to a medical expert for care. Quote, "Is this mere caprice?" the magazine asked its audience. But the letters captured something else. The news was offering a lifeline to a heavily marginalized queer community, an alternate future with a different, more fluid understanding of gender. Senya Kobach and Mark Weston each lived across the world from the mostly American readers of Sexology, but many saw themselves in the two men anyway. It is in the pages of Sexology that glimmers of a queer and trans embrace of Kobach and Weston surface, for people whose genders did not align with the one that had been assigned to them at birth. Kobach and Weston may as well have been folk heroes, proof that transitioning and creating a new life are possible, even on a national stage. The letters written to Sexology are one small data point, but they suggest a second dimension to the importance of Kobach and Weston. The two athletes didn't just change the sports world. They also brought new attention and possibility to queerness itself. Anyone struggling with their own gender could look to these two athletes and feel a rush of relief. Perhaps they were not alone after all. That's the end of that reading.
Can everybody hear me okay? Yeah? Thank you. Thank you all for coming out tonight. We're going to talk about the book in a second because the book is so good. And if you don't already have a copy or you haven't already ordered it, make sure you buy it before you leave tonight because you're going to want it. But before we get there, I just want to talk a little bit about Michael because I met Michael 6 years ago now, I believe.
Something like that.
When he reached out to me to ask if I could have any use for an intern to do some research. He was already in New York doing an internship, doing research every single day, while also in school, but he still wanted more to do. And thank God, because I desperately needed someone as smart as Michael and as good at doing research. For my book, The Women's House of Detention, Michael spent weeks at the New York Public Library going through all of the oldest gay periodicals to see if there were any mentions of incarceration or this prison that had been down in Greenwich Village. And then we continued to stay in touch. After that, he reached out to me about other things. I reached out to him. He came to New York. He started writing. I started reading him in The New Yorker, The Atlantic, all these places where I was like, can you introduce me to your editor? All of this is just to say that in just a few years, Michael has already shown himself to be an incredible scholar, an incredible researcher, someone who is digging up stuff that no one else has found, even in some cases where it has been sitting publicly accessible in libraries and all of us have missed it. So, what went into making The Other Olympians is an incredible amount of work directed by an incredible mind. And that's where I actually want to start our conversation tonight. The research process, right? Let's get into kind of the nerdy side of this. People are going to read the outcomes of the research, but how did you get to that place? Where did you start? Where did you even come across these names?
Yeah, well, first I want to clarify that I research for you once a week for a few weeks in the summer. It was not like a Herculean task, just to be clear. But yeah, and also like Hugh was like kind of the reason that I felt like I could do histories like this. I think he writes about queer history in such a just thoughtful and accessible way. And if you've not read his books, they're available at the end of this, so take them home. But yeah, I mean, like you've been kind of like the figure to me as like an author, for whatever that's worth. Okay, but the research. So I stumbled across the story for the first time in a digital newspaper archive, which like. Also, I don't know how I would have done this research like pre-internet, because what I like kind of do now is I subscribe to this thing called newspapers.com, which is incredible service. Really love them. If any representatives from newspapers.com are in the audience, thank you. But I was like, and I often like kind of keyword search like different sort of key like words related to sex or sexuality, and kind of look at different eras just kind of to see what would pop up. Because often what, and like you chronicle this so much in your work as well, there are often like all these really incredible local news stories about like possibly like gender transition, or about like also glimmers of like potentially same-sex unions that are like well known and well publicized even in the early 20th century. And so if you know the keywords to look for, you actually kind of find I think a lot of undiscovered things. Thanks again to newspapers.com. And so I was
not sponsored by them, but we would like to.
Yeah, yeah, please, if you want to give me money. And so I was actually, I'll make this really quick, but like I was researching this other person, this woman named Barbara Ann Richards, who's probably what identifies as trans today, who in 1941 petitioned the LA County Court to change the name on her identity documents to sort of reflect her name going forward, living as a woman. And she actually won that case in 1941. And like in the press reports that were describing, basically trying to make sense of readers like sort of what transition was and trying to give context, a couple of them mentioned like something along the lines of like, oh, you may have heard, you know, a few years ago about these athletes who transitioned. And I saw that and I was like, that's wild, I've not heard about these athletes. And then that was kind of the start of the rabbit hole for me. And I would say like, honestly, like as you kind of see from these excerpts that I read, like newspaper archives were a big source for me, but like I kind of started just like searching around, just curious what would be out there about these athletes. Because often I feel like I stumble across, and I'm sure you do too, stories like this, and then you like search their name and there's like a few articles, and then you can't really like trace them back. And I discovered pretty quickly that Kobach, which is why he's the focus of this, he wrote in 1936 in a Czech magazine this like really incredible article about his life. And when I say article, it was published weekly for months, so it amounts to like 40,000 words. It's like half the length of this book. That just goes through like kind of all the beats of his life. And I found this incredible translator, Megan Forbes. I think Megan is here. I'm sorry, I don't see you. Okay, yeah, Megan's over there. Who like really helped bring this to life. So like so much credit to Megan. But yeah, finding that and that just sort of narrative document about his life is what made me think that like this could be a larger project. And then I was also like so impressed by just like also how funny Kobach was. Like he was kind of a hater. He was really mean and had lots of like nasty clips kind of talking about like his work and everything. So it felt like kind of a storied queer tradition, I guess. And so like just seeing that document is really what galvanized me to get into this. And then eventually I realized that like Kobach and Weston actually are linked to these like Olympic policies in a somewhat direct way. And I think that like having that context made me think like, oh, okay, there's like a bunch of moving pieces that I want to try to put together.
Once you find that initial moment of research, right? So you've got their names, you have this idea that you want to dig a little deeper, go a little further. As you mentioned, there isn't a queer paper in the US since Friendship and Freedom, and there won't be again for many years. Where do you go next as a historian? What was your sort of next steps, and what kinds of resources were helpful?
I think I ended up going down the rabbit hole of like other kind of like these like science-y magazines to start with. And again, I say science kind of in air quotes, so I should, you know, note the air quotes. Because like magazines like Sexology were really covering these athletes, and I think seeing, and like they had these like Q&A sections, they had letters to the editor, and I think seeing that and seeing kind of the impact of these athletes in those publications was like really important early on. And then like another source that I used, okay, I actually didn't get this ready to show, but I like use a lot of like tabloid magazines and newspapers, and which I think were like, you know, understandably looked down upon in sort of the media landscape. Like these are very like lowbrow tabloids about like first-person articles of like, I robbed a bank, you know, and it's just kind of like, it's kind of like bottom-of-the-barrel stuff, but they were kind of the only ones in this era that would talk so directly and openly about queerness. And again, there was like lots of sensationalism, but I went through a bunch of those, and I like again, I brought one as a prop, but I'm gonna leave it. But like, I bought some on eBay, stuff like that. And yeah, I do know, I mean, you have your file out. I do know that was like, because we've talked about this before. Like I know in your work, that was kind of an important source. And like, I think Hugh's work, especially the House of Detention project, is interesting and kind of similar in that, I mean, a lot of it was like 1930s, 1940s, that was like kind of your starting point. And similarly is like talking about these people, especially like queer women and non-binary people incarcerated at this prison who were not written about or written about with like kind of intense skepticism in any kind of newspaper article that would exist. And I know from our discussions and from your wonderful footnotes that you also like dug into tabloids too.
eBay, man. eBay is like a really useful research technique. Yeah, like you said, a lot of these things, any kind of marginalized history, it's often easier to find mentions of it in places that are already disreputable, right? So in porn, in tabloids, in jokes, in stand-up comedy, you'll find things talked about. In my case, women in prison that you wouldn't find talked about elsewhere. So since we had already talked in advance, I did bring a little bit of show and tell, which I'm just gonna pass to people. Nobody steal it, I'll be so sad. But as I was doing my research, I set up all of these alerts. So anytime the Women's House of Detention or any of the individuals I was interested would come up on the internet, I would get sent things. One of my alerts was on eBay, where it would pull up tabloid magazines. And this was my favorite find. I was following a woman named Virginia McManus, who was a New York City substitute teacher who was arrested as a sex worker. She was also a child genius who had raised $250,000 for the war effort during World War II when she was in middle school. She was this like incredible mover and shaker in the underground world, and when she was arrested the second time in New York City and incarcerated, she became famous as the smartest prisoner the Women's House of Detention had ever held. And when she got out, she gave all of these interviews and in fact wrote a memoir that basically dance around the fact that she is a lesbian working as a sex worker with men. But it dances very closely. And where she came closest to telling the truth was in these confidential magazines. This one is from 1959, and the title is Virginia McManus, call girl school teacher, tells of her experiences, love without men in women's prison. But what I really love about this is the very top article on it. Car exhausts cause lung cancer, right? 1959, there are truths that can be published in places that are already disregarded that you will never see in a mainstream newspaper, and that is still true today. So I'm gonna pass this around, you guys can pass it back. You can check out, for absolutely no reason, the like 8-page spread on her has her putting on moisturizer and a bathing suit throughout it. I apologize. But it's a great document to show exactly what you're talking about, the kind of rabbit holes you have to go down, the unexpected places where you'll find the information that you need and that you're looking for. In a minute, we're gonna turn it over to the audience, so you all will have a chance to ask some questions. But one thing that kind of has recurred to me when you were talking about the 1930s and 40s, the moment in which we're doing the research and how all of this kind of leads up to the sex testing that we're dealing with today, I wonder if you could say a little bit about kind of the view on queer people, on trans people, on gender at this moment when Kobeck and Weston are becoming kind of celebrities. And maybe if you want to, a little bit how that parallels or doesn't parallel today.
Absolutely. I mean, if we're talking sort of in general about the view in the 1930s, I feel like always, many different tracks are happening at the same time. I think kind of like I alluded to in the beginning, on the public end, and I just think this is kind of important to like know, is that the public was really fascinated by these athletes and kind of fascinated about the potential of transition. And for context, like Kobeck in particular, after he transitioned, he wanted to play in men's sports. And people were, so it doesn't directly parallel like exactly what we're seeing today, which I'll get into in a sec. But yeah, so the public has this sense of openness to these possibilities, and I think it is really informed by these like local newspapers and these tabloid magazines that are telling them about like people metamorphosizing and their bodies like spontaneously changing for no reason that can be discerned. And it was an era in which sexology as a scientific practice was really on the rise throughout the early 20th century, and there did feel like there was a lot of potential around sort of like maybe what we call gender today. Again, they would only call it sex. And yeah, and so you have that, and then of course you have people who don't feel that way. And what the book chronicles is that in like this news, I'm trying to like there's so many like weird complexities to this, but basically when this like small group of sports officials who were associated with these different international sports federations, when they first learned of Quebec and Weston's transition, they saw it kind of as a problem and a threat for these reasons that are like hard to exactly discern, and I think it comes out of this kind of like complex way of talking about sex that existed at the time, and so you have like, I mean, I guess I can say this because it's, you know, in person, but like these like really horrible men who are like often very aligned with like fascist beliefs and in some cases directly aligned with like Nazism in the era, who ultimately see Quebec and Weston as threats. Even though, as I said at the beginning, like Quebec was only trying to play in men's sports, it was kind of confusing what they were even trying to do, but they somehow like convinced themselves that they needed to create policy really defining like who was allowed to be participate in men's sports and who's allowed to participate in women's sports, and of course the burden of that fell on women's sports as it like does today. And I think like what you see in these discussions is that the public was really open to, I think, the possibilities of transition, and open to this idea that like, you know, these categories of male and female are more permeable, and are perhaps not even the right categories at all. You see glimmers of that in the writing and in the response to these athletes. And then you see this group of sports officials who don't feel that way at all. I think often like connected to their own like ideological viewpoints, often tied to like the fascism of the era. And that kind of cements sex testing as policy in 1936. And so you see the first sex testing policy being passed at the Berlin Olympics by the International Amateur Athletic Federation, which is the governing body for track and field sports, and it's called World Athletics today. And basically, like, that is the first moment when there's this message on the books that, like, we should be allowed to, in this case, it was, like, literally, like, give a gynecological examination, like, literally strip down any person participating in women's sports, and decide whether or not they should be allowed to do this. This was happening in 1936. This was connected to this, like, Nazi sports doctor who was really pushing for this at the Berlin Olympics. And I think the policies have changed a lot in the decades since. Like, sports federations have constantly, like, suddenly discovered that sex, like biological sex, is a spectrum and more complicated than they are willing to understand. And so they, like, are constantly shifting between these different like rubrics of like how to define female, for instance. And so they go from these like cruel strip searches to these chromosome tests to testing hormones to this, more recently, this like complete scattershot set of policies. And I think what you really see, you know, I mean, I'm not an expert on sports policy, but like you see from like learning, I was gonna say more, but you see from this history, like kind of the rot at the core of these policies and how really at the end of the day, they've never been designed with athletes in mind or with a real aim or desire to respect just sort of the humanity of these athletes, just the spectrum of bodies and gender that we all exist on. And so as the policies change, I think you see that like core rot just continuing to like perpetuate. And I just think there was never a real conversation about how to actually include people in a more thoughtful way. And obviously counterfactuals, who knows, but like I feel like from reading the like coverage in the 1930s, I feel like there was a potential of having a different conversation of creating different policy. And I think what has happened is that just ever since, like anyone who's advocating for inclusion of, in particular like intersex women and trans femme women in sports has just been on the back foot. I don't know, sorry, I went off. I don't know if that answers the question, but yeah, the policies are rotten.
The policies are rotten, and I think you draw so many parallels between what's happening today and what was happening then in really smart ways, not simplistic parallels, but showing the variety of opinions and thoughts that were happening then. Because one of the things homophobia always tells us is that there was nothing before now, and if there was something, it was terrible, right? That there is no variety, there is no different idea out there. And I think one of the things you show so wonderfully is how many different ideas existed, even in the 1930s, even in a time when we have video of these people, right? A time that should be not within most people's living memory, but within accessible memory for all of us. So I think it is a real triumph. I know we don't have too much time tonight, so I want to turn it over to the audience. The way it's going to work is if you have a question, raise your hand, say it to us, we'll try to repeat it back so the whole audience can see it and make sure we heard it. So, any questions? Yep, I see a hand back there.
Congratulations, Michael. Fantastic job. You know that the Olympics are a political organization and they exist to reaffirm certain countries taking the world stage. Can you talk about how your discussion experience is situated within an idea of global politics?
Yeah, of global politics.
So the question is basically that the Olympics are an institution, a global political institution, as well as a sport institution, and how does your work sort of sit within those ideas?
Yeah, I think when you think about, like, I guess I think the thing that like was revealed to me while doing this research is that I had this impression going in as being, again, not someone versed in sports policy, that the Olympics was this like very well-oiled machine, that they knew what they were doing, that there was like a coherent bureaucracy in place. And what struck me is that at the start of the Olympics, it was absolute chaos. You like literally had people like falling over, cheating, like taking cars in the middle of like the marathon to like get to the front. And really ever since, like even when you look throughout the decades, the IOC and these like sports federations have actually not gotten very much more organized at all. And so, like, I mean, to talk about like sex testing for a second, it's like sex testing policy is now sort of passed on like the level of a sports federation. So like the federation governing track and field. But then in actuality, it's like different like sub-bodies that are deciding like how to administer these tests, who they will be testing, who can pass. It's this messy bureaucratic system. And yeah, I mean, I just think like when it comes to global politics, I guess there's many different directions to go in that, but I'll just say kind of in general that you see, like I think when you look at the Olympics and you look at these sports bodies, you see mess, and I think, and just like this lack of care and foresight, and I think that has kind of always been part of it. And I guess it's just important to me in this book to center the people in the bureaucracies and see just like the people with their very specific experience and biases who are informing all these decisions about like who to allow to participate on a national level or on a personal level of an athlete. Sorry, I don't know if that directly answered the question, but that's the gist of it.
Yeah, one thing I always think about in regards to this is not just the ways in which the Olympics dominates gender, right? It says that we have countries that recognize their gender categories and they don't get places in the Olympics, right? But also what sports are chosen for the Olympics. Those are political choices, right? There's certainly sports that America excels in, and yet there are all these sports that are constantly on the list trying to make it, right? These are political decisions, even when it's just, it seems like the level of like what sports are allowed. Other questions? Yeah.
When I first read your book, I was so surprised to learn the athletes that prompted this sort of panic around gender at the Olympics were male, competing in men's sports. Just because the conversation around transgender athletes was so dominated by anxiety around Leah Thompson, around Caster Semenya, and even like non-binary athletes competing in women's sports. Why do you think that shift happened, this anxiety that's primarily about gender competing in women's sports from
Yeah.
its original start in men's sports?
Sorry. The question is basically like talking about how like Kovac and Weston were living as men, and in Kovac's case wanting to, like Weston had just retired from sports and Kovac wanted to live as a man and participate in men's sports. And now obviously like we see all of these policies directed in particular at like trans femme people and intersex women who want to play in the women's category. It is like, the answer is just kind of like a weird quirk, I think, of how Kovac was discussed. And so there was this like, it's like also, I guess maybe there are two answers. I think one is that the sports officials who first passed sex testing policy and who saw like news about Quebec and decided it was a problem didn't really think about it very much. They weren't reading sexology. Like they weren't thinking about kind of the nuances of the body. And what they saw was that they didn't like the idea that someone would just move between these categories. They saw it as a threat and they just were like, let's just stop this. And I don't actually think they even truly considered much nuance. But the nuance is that like, the fact that Quebec was described in the press as like his body like metamorphosizing in some way, because again, there was not really a concept of gender. Like Quebec would describe himself as always feeling like a man, and kind of alluding to this sort of idea of gender that we have today. But the press would say stuff about how like, you know, he woke up one morning and then suddenly like, you know, he had like a beard or whatever. Not that, but like he was suddenly sort of inhabiting this body that was associated with masculinity. And so I think, again, these sports officials who weren't even trying to be thoughtful about these athletes in the first place, like maybe read a couple of these reports. I can see in like the letters that they wrote, they didn't really understand, and didn't really, like they would always misspell Quebec's name. They didn't really bother to like think deeply about this. They saw this and they saw these reports that he had metamorphosized, and they just thought like, you know, this is some kind of problem if he had wanted to play in women's sports. I don't know, it's also like hard to psychoanalyze these people ultimately. But yeah, I do think it's like an intriguing quirk of these policies that Quebec and Weston were kind of ultimately the catalyst, and then you just see the brunt of it on athletes like Leah Thomas today.
And one thing I would say just from my work on the Women's House of Detention is that from the late 1800s, basically post-Civil War up through World War II, America had real anxiety around quote-unquote masculine women, mannish women. We have whole laws, courts, prisons set up that are really focused on improperly feminine women. There's a lot more concern around women violating gender norms in ways that post-World War II, it still exists, to be clear, but we begin to see a lot more concern around men violating gender norms in ways that you just don't see as much. So when the first, basically when we set up the women's prison system in the late 1800s, the understanding goes like this. There are only 3 jobs a woman can have. You can be a wife, or you can be a maid. And for both of those, you need to be properly feminine. If you are not properly feminine, you will end up on the streets where you will become a prostitute. And so therefore, all improperly feminine women, whether they are too masculine, too feminine, too black, too immigrant, are seen in this lens of like a real paranoia, not just around gender, but around economy. They are going to be social drains. And so we live in this world in the late 1800s, early 1900s, where you have a ton more drag kings out there. You have a lot more laws around what women can do and say and act and where they can be in public. So it doesn't surprise me that this first kind of gender panic around sports comes around people we would today see as trans men, right? That's very emblematic of the time. Post-World War II, everything changes. But again, this is one of the things that kind of gets memory holed by homophobia, right? It all gets kind of erased what happened before. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. We have anyone on this side of the audience? No one on this side of the audience has spoken? No? All right, well, we have one there. You're in the aisle, close enough.
Speaking of panics, I wonder if there was kind of this concept of like protecting the children. Especially now, I teach high school and I see this kind of hand-wringing over, can the children be trusted to, choose their own gender or transition? Is there this social contagion, all this sort of transphobia that is linked to homophobia, maybe in the past? So I'm wondering if you kind of saw that in your research at all, or is that more recent?
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think I'll repeat the question. The question is basically like, now a lot of like transphobes and people passing these like anti-trans policies are talking about, or framing it through the lens of like social contagion, and often talking about children for some reason. And I actually think that you don't see that in the 1930s, and you actually don't see that, I think, really until pretty recently. I guess I can't speak as much to like the 90s, like more recent history, but in the era that I'm looking at, the idea of protecting the children does not come up, and I think that's because these policies really started from the top down, and they really started at the level of like international competition, like the Olympics or like the European Championships. These like big competitions for really elite athletes. And what has happened since is that now there are like an incredible number of anti-trans policies that ban specifically like trans femme people, trans girls from playing in school sports at all in a lot of states. And you know, my guess would be that I think what we did in the 1930s by sort of codifying this idea that you could neatly cleave people into categories of male and female, even when, you know, like there was plenty of reason to think that sex was more complicated, that people were more complicated than that. I think just ever in the decades since you've just seen this idea normalized in sports, and I think this discourse lately around even moving these policies in different ways, not exactly the same policies, but these anti-trans policies into schools, into, you know, like middle and high school sports. That I think that comes out of what happened in the 1930s, and that comes out of decades and decades of people being exposed to the idea that, like, you know, like testing athletes and deciding who could be in what category is normal, and that's like that we should have organizations that are doing that. So yeah, I just think we're seeing like now more and more iterations of that. I think because of just how like inoculated I think, you know, certain people in the establishment might have become to this idea. Okay, I think that's the last question. And I'm only doing this because I just wanted to say. Okay, I didn't cut it off. It's no time, but I just want to say that like so at the table like in the back, like kind of by where I'm going to be signing, there's like this like random table where there's a few newspapers laid across it. And so those are some of the like contemporaneous coverage of Quebec and Weston. And you know, just what's interesting, just so you could see how they're written about. These were newspaper articles, so you don't unfortunately get like sexology printed, so you don't get like the fun ones, but you can kind of see like the ways in which these athletes were sensationalized. You can see the confusion around pronouns, like they switch between truly every conceivable pronouns in these articles. And I just think gives you kind of a taste for like what the average person was reading in 1935 and 36. So those are at that table in the corner. And that's all I was supposed to say, I think.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you. One more round of applause. And applause for the visual drama and for visual magic. And some extra applause because it's Pride and you all turned out tonight. So thank you all.
Thank you all so much for coming. We're so excited to have you here. If you're still with us on the live stream, you can buy a book in the link in the description. If you're with us here, you can buy a book at the front if you haven't already. You can also buy Hugh's books. Thank you all so much for coming. We are going to do a line like across this side coming down. Michael's going to be signing where you checked in. We do have a hard out at 8:30. I have to lock the doors at 8:30, so just please keep that in mind during the signing line. Be sure to grab your things because I don't have the keys, so once I lock the door, that's up till tomorrow. That is all. Thank you all so much. Have a great night.